So it's a privilege to welcome back for this theme of leadership and providing a vision. Welcome back to the OU Convention. Welcome back to Beth Jacob. Michael Medved. Okay, Michael is one of the leading and most influential political and social commentators in America today. Throughout his career, an Orthodox Jew, throughout his career, he has been a leading voice for values-based leadership. And best-selling author, radio talk show personality, whose show reaches over 3.5 million listeners on nearly 200 stations across the country. He's someone who is thoughtful, he's traveled the country, he's been thinking about issues, he understands our Jewish community, and so that's why it's such a great pleasure. Great to see you, Michael, and hear you that you're back in action, better than ever, and it's really a pleasure. Without further ado, to welcome and introduce Michael Medved.
Well, it's wonderful to be back at Beth Jacob, and thank you, Rabbi Top, and thank you, Rabbi Kalinsky, for all of your work, wherever Rabbi Kalinsky is. He's probably working somewhere right now. There he is. And Sandy, and for all of the other distinguished Rebbeim and scholars and Balabotim, so many of whom I know for a long time, and it's wonderful to see everybody. And in terms of the introduction, I'm put in mind of a way that Lyndon Johnson, who was in many ways not an admirable leader, but he did have a way with words. He got a particularly lavish introduction at one point when he was Senate Majority Leader before he became Vice President and then President. And he said, that was a wonderful introduction. That was a great introduction. And you know, I only wish that my late parents were here to hear it, because my papa would have enjoyed it, and my mama would have believed it. And that is always an appropriate response that highlights some gender differences. And speaking of gender differences, I mean, one of the things that happens in our polling and our selections is people classify everything according to gender and ethnicity and income and education level. But you know what? There is one proposition in which there is astonishing unanimity among the American people. Astonishing unanimity. And you know what it is? People of every walk of life, of liberals and conservatives and moderates, independents, Republicans, Democrats, East, West, North, South, everybody agrees our leadership in this country stinks. I see an easy applause line. You know, I mean, you talk about it, look at the approval rating for leaders in various institutions. It is pathetic in the United States. It is pathetic in the United States. Right now, the President of the United States, who was elected twice, he won majorities of the popular vote twice. The President of the United States has historically low approval ratings, even for him. And yet he is a burning pyre of popularity compared to the Congress. I checked recently, I checked a couple of days ago. Do you know what the approval rating is for members of Congress? How many people think Congress is doing a good job, approve of the job Congress is doing? It's 12%. Now, John McCain says when you're down at 12%, that's pretty much paid staff and blood relatives. They're the only people who approve of what is going on with Congress. It's an astonishing thing. 3/4 of Americans, according to typical polls, and there are different polls about this, think the country is headed in the wrong direction. For the first time ever, an overwhelming majority of Americans, more than 60%, say that they agree with the statement, the American dream is dead. We talk about the theme is leadership for challenging times. I saw that's the official, I think, title for the theme of the whole OU convention. And it's an appropriate title. I saw coming in that my topic was not leadership for challenging times, it was leadership for troubling times. and maybe more appropriate, I mean, especially considering the events very close by to here. Today on the radio, and I broadcast today from Glendale, from KRLA, which by the way, for people who haven't discovered KRLA, you can give this station, AM 870, a little bit of love. 12 uninterrupted hours of broadcasting by Jewish guys who take Judaism somewhat seriously, at least. I mean, beginning with the wonderful Ben Shapiro at 6 a.m., 6 a.m. to 9 a.m., Dennis Prager from 9 a.m. to noon, me from noon to 3, and then Mark Levin, who I always worry about Mark's health, but Mark from 3 to 6. You know, for a Christian-owned company, this is a lot of Yidden. In fact, it's a garden of Yidden. And I was at the station today, and we were talking about this. Somebody joked, said, yeah, we're thinking of changing the call letters from KRLA to KJEW. But that probably, we have not won any awards at the station from the Council on American Islamic Relations. Okay, with that in mind, let me frame this question about the kind of leadership that we need and what is so lacking in American leadership at the moment. Let me frame the question by asking a question about Yiddishkeit. And it's something that I was actually thinking about on the plane on the way down here. We flew down here on Wednesday morning and broadcast from KRLA on Wednesday, and we're going to be broadcasting again tomorrow, and then back here for Shabbos for this whole wonderful convention, which I wouldn't miss even if I weren't speaking. But in any event, what I was thinking about was this. The most important events next to the OU convention in Jewish life really are weddings, because weddings secure the Jewish future. And what is absolutely necessary at a wedding? Well, you need a chassan, you need a kala, you need a bride and a groom, you need a masader kedushin, you need somebody to be in charge, but even that is sort of fungible. You need shnei edim. You need 2 kosher witnesses, right? And how do you define a kosher witness at a wedding? And the edim play a crucially important job. Name is on the kesuva. The edim have to be shomer Shabbat. Okay, this is an interesting question. The gentleman in Rabbi Top's story who was eating under rabbinic supervision, as long as he's shomer Shabbos, presumably he can be an aid. And meanwhile, somebody who may go to daily minyan every single day, who may be learning daf yomi, who is a bal tzedakah, who is a wonderful Jew, but drives to shul on Shabbos, he can't be an aid. Why that standard? Why is that standard so crucial to the crucial role of edus, of witnessing, in a Jewish wedding? Okay, to help answer that question, let's take a look at the key missing perspective in American political and cultural life today. And that missing element in our perspective is perspective. We tend not to have any accurate vision of who we are, of where we are going. Americans seem to be stumbling around in the dark with a total lack of perspective. What do I mean? This is something that comes up on the radio from time to time, and I'm sure some of you have heard it. Is people will call in and they will evince the typical sentiments that you hear today. This is the worst time in American history. America's never had such a terrible crisis. The American dream is dead. Things are miserable. Everyone is suffering. The country is just a spot away from doomsday. Dr. Ben Carson, who's kind of a friend of mine, he even, by the way, gives me credit, and I'm very proud. You can ask me about this in the question period. Dr. Carson gives me credit for getting him to Yale, where he was as an undergraduate. And I'm flattered by that because I think Dr. Carson's a great guy. But Dr. Carson says repeatedly in the course of his campaign that America is deeply similar to Nazi Germany. You know, unfortunately, there are a lot of people here who may have personal experience or certainly have family experience with Nazi Germany. America is many things. We are not similar to Nazi Germany. It's a sickening comparison. It's invidious. It's wrong. It's wrong-headed. And no one who is running for the nation's highest office should ever compare the United States of America to the Third Reich. What is this stupidity? Why do people take it seriously? Why do so many people in America feel that the nation is worse than it's ever been before? By what measure? This is what I would ask people. What's so terrible about life in America? I mean, seriously, look, I bring to this a unique perspective because I'm a cancer survivor. My diagnosis for stage 3 throat cancer was, I'm 4 days away from our 1-year anniversary of diagnosis. And thank you, everybody has asked, and by the way, thank you to people who said Misha Berachs and Tefillot in my honor and in my behalf. It worked. I feel great. I feel terrific. And yes, I believe that I did have siyata d'shemaya and I did have help in this regard. But you know what? I also had the best medical care system in the world behind me. I got the kind of medical care that would have been possible to get anywhere else, or that someone could certainly not have gotten even in this country 25 years ago. Does anyone doubt that the medical care available to you right now in the USA is the best anywhere at any time? And yes, Eretz Yisrael has terrific medical care too. Now, it's phenomenal. The standard of living that we have. You know, here's an interesting figure, and this is one of those things in LA with the flourishing of kosher restaurants. In LA and in Oxnard. I mean, who would think that Oxnard, California would be home to a world-class, world-famous kosher restaurant? Pretty good wines, too. Look, this flourishing may actually equalize something that has been different between religious Jewish people and the rest of the population. Do you know that the average American in 2014, which is the most recent year for which the Labor Department has figures available, the average American spends more money today eating out than on medical care? The notion that Americans are suffering, it's absurd. Today I had a caller who was saying that you could understand why this evil person killed 14 people and wounded 17 others in San Bernardino because he was so oppressed. What's oppressed, for God's sake? Really, this is a guy who was born in Chicago. He's educated, courtesy of the taxpayers of California, at California State University, San Bernardino. He's working at a government job, and the exact figure for his compensation in 2013, most recent year for which it's available, $72,230 a year, which is pretty good for a 28-year-old. We have a son who's looking for a job right now. And, you know, he's only 23, but listen, that's what's oppressed. Honestly, in the question period, I would be glad to take your answers. What is terrible about America? People are upset about things like these shootings. The crime rate, the violent crime rate, is the lowest it has ever been measured, ever, since they've had statistics. The murder rate in New York City is lower than it was measured in 1870. Okay, do you know what that means? Do you know how many, literally, hundreds of thousands of lives have been saved from being shattered by the fact that our murder rate in this country, with all the shootings, with all the stuff you read about, how much we have saved in terms of suffering and death and blood and horror because we've done a better job with policing and on our criminal justice system? How many black lives, which do matter, how many of those lives have been saved? And by the way, if you look at Eretz Yisrael, people who say that things are so terrible in the world, if you look at Israel, we were just talking about this at the table. It used to be, people would say, how can you make Aliyah? It's such a tough life. You used to have to wait, how many years? We have some Israelis here. In the 1970s, could you get a telephone right away in your home? No! People had to wait for years to get a phone. My parents, alav shalom, tried to make Aliyah in 1949. And it was simply too hard for them. But today, the standard of living, my father finally made Aliyah and lived the last 19 years of his life in Yerushalayim. But the standard of living in Israel is phenomenal. It's comparable if you look at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD figures. Israel is bunched right next to the United Kingdom in terms of the standard of living. Can you imagine? And by the way, way ahead of Scotland and Wales. Okay, you may say that's not saying much. All right, no anti-Welsh or Scottish sentiment here. Look, the truth of the matter is that in recent years, far from this being the worst time in human history, do you know that people estimate UN figures, and they have no reason to lie on this, about 2 billion human beings have moved away from abject poverty into what is generally construed as middle-class life. 2 billion. A lot of them in China and India, the two most populous countries in the world. China and India together have 3 billion people in them. And if you look at the change in living standards, the lack of starvation, the opportunities, it's extraordinary. So why are we so upset? Why are we so negative? I want to give you 3 reasons and then come back to answering the question about Eidim and Shabbat. 3 reasons why we are all so upset and miserable. Number 1 has to do with a focus on disaster. Number 2 has to do with a separation from human contact. And number 3 has to do with an absence of memory. Okay, a lot of this stuff has to do with what we spend most of our time on in our lives today in America. And here, again, this is something that the Labor Department compiles statistics on. In a lifetime, other than sleeping, they measure how people spend their lives. Most people will spend most of their lives sleeping. That's the biggest chunk of time. And you can figure that out. If you're sleeping 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, that's more than you work, and you don't retire from sleeping, at least we hope not. And you begin sleeping even before kids begin competing to get into their competitive nursery school so they can have a little leg up to getting into Harvard or Yale. Okay, sleeping, big effort. What do we spend more of our time on than anything except sleeping? Answer is TV. And today it's not just TV. Today it's TV and video games and the internet and screens. There was a recent study that I covered on the air from the American Academy of Pediatrics that today an average teenager in the United States spends how many hours a day in front of a screen, either a little screen that they carry with them or a big computer screen or a TV screen or some kind of screen? It's 9 hours a day. It's bizarre. We are giving over the bulk of our lives to these flickering images. Sometimes they're words. Sometimes there's interesting stuff on the internet. It's a wonderful tool. I mean, I'm in the middle, my wife and I are both in the middle of writing books right now. And the internet is a tremendous help to that process, no doubt about it. But think about what it means. The point about this is the world of screens, the world of media. And boy, did I see this yesterday, broadcasting here from KRLA. We do not have a news business in the United States. We don't. We have the bad news business. If something terrible happens, if an evil Islamic fanatic comes into a Christmas party, and it's unbelievable, they had someone on CBS News who was saying, well, perhaps calling it a Christmas party was a trigger for this young man. It's unbelievable. I played the segment twice. You couldn't believe it. And then people saying, well, these were government employees. It must have been some anti-government right-wing militia. It wasn't. It was an Islamic extremist. But he comes in, he kills these people. The suffering is unimaginable. Imagine that you're one of those families. that has lost someone under these circumstances, or you're somebody who has a wound that may impact you for the rest of your life. This is an unbelievable thing. And yet it is a huge news story. It crowds out everything else. The saying in local news, and everyone knows this, if it bleeds, it leads. If there's an accident, if there's destruction, if there's a fire, if there's a misery, weather never makes a big story. When weather is beautiful, as I understand it is here in Southern California a lot of the time, if the weather is beautiful, it never makes news. Never. If there's a storm and trees are down and power is out, if there's a flood, if there's a drought, if there's something miserable, that's news. And by the way, the same thing goes with the state of the environment. When I was talking about things being better than ever before, in Los Angeles, the numbers are staggering. We had a real smog problem in this city in 1955. That was about the worst. It is vastly better. The air quality, the water quality, even the LA River, right, is making little tiny bits of improvement and maybe more to come. But for goodness sake, what is so terrible? What is so terrible is the focus on negativity. Leo Tolstoy said in Anna Karenina, the first sentence is, happy families are all happy in the same way. Unhappy families are each unhappy in compelling and fascinating ways. That's why most of our stories on TV and movies, in the newspaper, everywhere, the stories that people like to hear are not about happy families. They're not about happiness. They're not about achievement. They're not about good news. They're not about cancer recovery. They're about death. They're about destruction. They're about negativity, which is why most Americans don't know that crime has gone down. Most Americans don't know that our living standards have gone up. You ought to experience it. How many people here in this room have grandparents, or let's say even great-grandparents, who were significantly worse off than you are? Okay? I would assume just about everybody. Just about every, and that's not unique to Jews. That's true of everyone in the United States of America. Do you know, I looked it up recently, and this is something I was speaking at a wonderful, wonderful event for NCSY last night, which was absolutely inspiring. And to see the growth of NCSY, which is reaching so many young people with a substantive Torah message and substantive energy for Yiddishkeit. One of the things I cited to them is that in 1969, when I graduated from college, 5% of Americans had undergraduate four-year college degrees. Is that amazing? 5%. And by the way, it was about 2% of women. Because there were a lot of schools. When I went to Yale, there were no women undergraduates. No women undergraduates at Princeton or Dartmouth. In any event, today, what percentage of Americans have undergraduate college degrees, four-year degrees? About 30%. It's shocking. The majority of Americans who graduate from high school go on to a community college or to a four-year college. And it's now a small majority of black Americans. But why don't we know that? Because the focus is on negativity, and most of us get our impressions directly from mass media, which cover negativity and deny you, in general, access to the good news, which is all around us. It's a tremendous problem. And it's one of the reasons, by the way, and they've done studies on this. George Gerbner, may he rest in peace, at the University of Pennsylvania at the Annenberg School, did all of these studies on people's attitudes toward the world around them. And there is a direct linear correlation between the number of hours of television that people watched and their negative view of the world. The people who were most optimistic around the world around them were the people without TV. And by the way, there's a guy named Brandon Centerwall at the medical school at University of Washington who did studies in Canada. Canada got TV late, particularly in some of the provinces that aren't Quebec and Ontario, Manitoba and Saskatchewan. There are whole areas that got TV late. And one of the changes as soon as TV came in, and Dr. Centerwall measured this, was that people became more negative about their surroundings. They got a worse impression. Why? Because it's all about dysfunction. It's all about marital breakdown. It's all about infidelity. It's all about difficulties. It's all about problems. Which brings me to the second reason that people have no perspective on where we are and how fortunate we are, and how to continue good fortune rather than to deny it. And that has to do with our isolation from human contact. One of the things about American life that you can say is vastly different from the past is we don't have time for other people. And again, here, all of these studies about the way that Americans spend their time, the studies are appalling. Do you know what time, how many hours a day a typical husband and wife spend speaking to one another? And believe it or not, the Labor Department does measure this. Typical American husband and wife, any guesses? 30 minutes, 2 hours. 10 minutes, you're awfully close. They say about 15 minutes a day. And you know what? The chances are they aren't substantive conversations. They're probably conversations about who's going to pick up the kids, where's the laundry, honey, can you find my keys? Why are women better at finding keys than men? There must be a Torah reason for it. I don't understand. In any event, look, we don't have time to talk to our spouses, let alone to our neighbors, let alone to other members of the family. When you think about the 9 hours a day that children spend in front of screens, and the 10 minutes a day, officially, that they spend talking to their parents, you really think as a parent you can influence your child successfully without a commitment of time together? This is a huge American problem. Most people in this country know contestants on reality TV. They know fictional characters in Game of Thrones or Empire. They know people like that better than they know the people who live next door. The sense of community in this country that used to be the country's great strength, and this is one of the reasons that people are so unhappy, is despite our material blessings, with 2 career families, and now most American homes, in most American homes, both husband and wife work. Sometimes the wife works part-time, sometimes the husband works part-time, sometimes the husband doesn't work at all. But with the additional hours working, with the commitment we all make to email, to checking our favorite websites, to television, we don't connect with other people. One of the most important books, I think, of recent years is a book by Robert Putnam, who just retired from teaching sociology at Harvard. He wrote a book called Bowling Alone. And what's the chiddush in Bowling Alone? It's this. He remembered growing up in the Midwest in the 1950s. And bowling was a very big deal. Different organizations had bowling nights. And you'd come out with a league, you'd come out with people, and everybody would be... And he was fascinated because he checked and he saw that the statistics indicated that just as many Americans bowl today as bowled in the 1950s. Amazing. There might even be some people here who bowl. But you know what? People today bowl alone. The bowling leagues are gone. The bowling leagues are part of what he called at one time the great American animal organizations. Lions, elk, moose, Kiwanis, whatever they are. And Rotary isn't an animal, but it's the same idea. But these organizations used to be a big deal. And I'm sure we all have uncles or grandparents or others, sometimes parents, for whom these organizations were meaningful. B'nai B'rith lodges used to be a big deal. Today, most people are exhausted. They come home. They give themselves to the screen, either TV or computer, and that's it. Now, what does this have to do with people being depressed? Absolutely everything. Because the truth of the matter is, it also explains this anomaly, which so many sociologists, including Robert Putnam, have commented on. When you ask Americans about the state of the country, they are universally negative. And yet, when you ask them about their own situation, they're almost universally positive. Most Americans are negative about the country, but positive about their own prospects and family. The most striking thing about this is they did this survey 2 years ago, and they asked people, how would you describe the state of your marriage? For the people who are married, and most American adults are married. The majority of American adults are still married. They're not married with children, necessarily, but still married. And they asked married adults, would you rate your marriage as very happy, happy, somewhat happy, not so happy, or not at all happy? 81% rated their marriages as very happy. And you may ask, well, then why do we have a 70% divorce rate? We don't. We don't have a 50% divorce rate. This is one of those big lies that I've written about a lot. And by the way, I would love to sign some books for you later tonight. But it's something I've written about a lot. There is zero statistical evidence that we have a 50% divorce rate or ever did, and the divorce rate has been going down in this country. So why are people, they're happy in their own marriages, but you ask them, what's the state of marriage in America? Most people think, well, marriage, that's just for gay people and Catholic priests. It's the only people who want to get married. No, it's not true. Most people get married, and statistically, and the Census Bureau can confirm this, somebody who's getting married in his first marriage for both the husband and wife, they have a 70% of remaining married until one of them dies. People don't know it. Why not? Because of the isolation from other people. People know their own lives. And for instance, people, you ask them about your doctor, my medical care, most Americans think the world of their doctors. You ask them about doctors in general, puh. The medical care system is broken. Either Obama ruined it or Obama was unable to save it. But people seem to be very upset with the medical care system. But their own medical care, terrific. You ask people about the schools. American education, terrible. Have you ever spoken to someone who says, you know, I send my child to a public school or a private school or a yeshiva or a religious school? School I send them to is terrible. You will occasionally meet people like it, very rarely. Very rarely. Most Americans have great confidence in their own children's schools, but everybody else's schools stink. Dr. Putnam writes about this. He says it's the I'm okay, you're not syndrome. And what is this based on? The fact that in your own life, the stuff that you do, the stuff that you see, the stuff that you experience, you know it because you live it. And you realize how great you have it. But the other stuff, you don't know other people. You don't interact with other people. We're not members of community. We're isolated. So what do they base it all on? News bulletins. They base it all on this bad news media immersion that we were talking about before. And that brings me to the final point, which is the absence of memory. One of the problems with a media-driven culture is it is by its very nature impatient. And here again, Dr. Gerbner at University of Pennsylvania did this very interesting study where he analyzed television, which of course is such an important part of American people's lives. And just the amount of time that a typical camera angle would be held on screen. And it's one of those things, if you go home and you watch TV and you look at it, you'll notice the difference immediately. In the 1950s, in the days of I Love Lucy and Sid Caesar's show, they would hold a given shot for an average of 54 seconds. Today on TV, they hold a given shot for an average of about 6 seconds. Everything is quick, 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 quick. On MTV, it's even quicker. On Sesame Street, it's even quicker. And what it makes is for impatience. Everything is about impatience. Everything is about the immediate. It's why you hear idiot things all the time. This is the worst economic disaster in American history. It was unpleasant. It was miserable. You know what? Even though the market had another terrible day today, and I know it did, and I'm sorry for that, this is the worst economic disaster in American history. Do you know how long the market was down during the Great Depression? And then right again in 1937, 38, they had another big fallback. 1893, we had an unemployment rate in that Great Depression, which many people consider worse than the Depression of 1929, 1931. In 1893, we had 35% unemployment. And that was at a time when you did not have two-career households, where people literally could starve. Okay, the reason that people say the stupid stuff that they do, this is the worst this, it's the worst that, the weather is the worst climactic disaster, is the worst earthquake ever. I remember this so vividly. Do you remember the Loma Prieta quake in San Francisco? When it was considered, somehow it was God's punishment for the fact that they had the Oakland A's versus the San Francisco Giants in the World Series. So during the World Series, they had this earthquake. And I remember some of the coverage, and I was concerned. My brother Ben lives in San Francisco area. So some of the coverage was, the devastation is awful. It's unimaginable. And there were 50 people who died. It was a serious quake. But you know, the worst earthquake in American history? Are you kidding me? Compared to the first San Francisco earthquake in 1906? Why does this stuff happen? The worst this, the most serious that, the bloodiest this, the worst. Because people have no memory. People don't know history. That's why older people, those of us who remember, in other words, one of the things that gets me angry, I got significantly angry at all of the people, and there were literally millions of them. George W. Bush was the worst president in American history. Doesn't look so bad now, does he? Okay, but that was stupid. It was pathetic. Especially when one could argue that his actions in rescuing the economy when it was teetering the banking system in significant trouble, I think will historically be remembered as somewhat heroic. Bush wasn't the worst president in American history, and you know what? I mean, I hate to say it, and don't throw anything, please. Obama's not the worst president in American history either. And no, he isn't. Conservatives are wrong to say so. And you should remember Jimmy Carter, just by way of reference, okay? I mean, Carter was worse, and even more self-righteous. Even more self-righteous. And by the way, Franklin Pierce was considerably worse, and James Buchanan was considerably worse, and John Tyler was arguably much worse. You know, we've had unsuccessful presidents. And do I believe that, look, I am not a Barack Obama fan. I spend a lot of my time on the radio talking about not being a Barack Obama fan. But you need to have perspective. And the perspective is history will look back on his administration as something of a mix. I think his personal leadership and his personal quirks, like the instinct every time there's a shooting to go back to this gun control mantra, it's like the old days when the doctor used to take that rubber mallet and hit your knee, and you kick, and instead of kicking the knee, Obama says, we need more gun control, we need more gun control, we need more, whatever the problem is. That's the answer, that's the reflex, that's the instinct. Okay, I'm not a fan of that.